Hey everybody, thanks for having me here at the NNGA annual meeting. I'm going to talk about Native American agroforestry. My name is Zach Elfers and I live in Pennsylvania in southern York County by the Susquehanna River, the lower Susquehanna River Hills region. I propagate a wide variety of native plants in general, but I have a nursery, Future Forest Plants, that focuses on tree crops in particular, especially like native tree crop species. So I grow a lot of hickory of all stripes, pecan, black walnut, butternut, persimmon, pawpaw, plum of several species, honey locusts, oaks, chestnuts, all that stuff. Anyway, so the topic that I'm going to share here is much requested, and also it's going to be really difficult because I've only got 25 minutes here and there's so much to unpack in this topic, and there's just so much to talk about, and so I'm gonna have to do my best to speak quickly, and I might not be able to elaborate on certain points as much as I would like to, but in the end here I'll share my email address and you're free to reach out to me personally if you need to, and of course there will also be Q&A. So let's make the most of this. Anyway, as I begin here, I want to give an acknowledgement of the land that I'm on. This was historically the land of the Susquehannock, but it was also a meeting place for so many people. Where we're situated here geographically, we're kind of like the northern edge of the southeast, but also the southern edge of the northeast. And so we had people from the Powhatan Confederacy, the Chesapeake Bay, for example, come up to this region on the lower Susquehanna River. And we also had people like the Haudenosaunee come down from the northeast to this region. We had the Lenape come from the east, and we had the Shawnee come from the west. So, I mean, at various points in time, this land has been occupied by Shawnee, by Conoy, by Nanticoke, by Lenape, by Susquehannock, by Conestoga, by Tugaloo and Saponi, even as they were passing through this area during the period of colonization, basically escaping what was happening in the Piedmont of Virginia and the Carolinas, and going to join under the banner of the Cayuga with the Haudenosaunee, who were giving refuge to a lot of refugee peoples in the late 1700s, the so-called Southern Door. Anyway, so yeah, we're living on occupied land, and there's a lot of grief in that history. The Trail of Tears, I guess about 1830. We're almost coming up on the 200-year anniversary of that, and that's nothing to celebrate. So one of the things that really inspires me is that even though the native peoples have been largely displaced or assimilated here in the East Coast, their absence is conspicuous. Whereas if you go out to the West, there's a lot more land set aside and reservations and things for native people. And, these are not perfect by any means, but the point being, when I traveled in Oregon and California and places like this, in Nevada, you could go around towns, you could go to grocery stores, and you would see native people. They were around. It was still their home and still, their place. And you come to a place like Pennsylvania, and if you see a person who's actually native, it's very very rare, and that's very sad. Yeah, so but what inspires me is that the legacy that native peoples left on the landscape is still here. We're very much living in the thick of it, and that is just amazing to understand and to start to grapple with and acknowledge. So here I'm going to start to share my screen. Share screen. All right, so Native American agroforestry. Let's It's a big topic. So let me not get bogged down on explaining this too much. Hopefully the image says 1,000 words here. This is what the landscape looks like under Mayan agriculture, what the Mayan civilization looks like under Mayan agriculture. And then on the bottom right, you have what European civilization looks like under European farming. Very different relationship with the landscape, a very different result. Europeans, because of the enclosure acts and all of that happened in Europe's ancestral history and ancestral trauma, we started to carve off land into fixed fields and divvied up into private property. And then suddenly you weren't farming with ecological succession anymore. You were trying to arrest succession year after year after year and do the same thing year in, year out with the same boundaries. And it's led to a lot of disastrous results, including the Anthropocene that we're currently trying to adapt to. Whereas the Mayan civilization, they practiced shifting cultivation or swiddening, or what's been derogatively called slash and burn agriculture. So they were always moving through the landscape and creating a patchwork of different kinds of subsistence ecosystems. So you would have everything from freshly burned garden areas to meadows and grasslands to fields that were starting to recover into perennials and trees and fruiting bushes and shrubs and thickets and things like that. And you had orchards, you had woodlands, you had high forest, things that we would think of as like pristine, with tall canopy trees and super diverse jungle-like growth. So how do we get away from Eurocentric practices and back towards indigenous practices? So a lot of background goes into this. Why did native landscapes look the way they did? I mean, part of it is the technique, the slash and burn, and also the landscape level tending practices that were used to manage the landscape. But another part of it just has to do with the connectivity of the landscape. I mean, landscapes are naturally connected. I mean, that's how ecology is, right? So you've got all the variations of geography and terrain and form, and the way the creek and riverbeds are formed and shaped, and how the soil is an interaction with the weather and with the climate and with hydrology and topography and terrain and geology and the weathering of stone and mineral, and all of these interactions, right? But then there are interactions that are unique to the human sphere. One of the things that's unique about us as a species, well, it's not unique about us as a species, actually, it's the opposite, but it's particular to us in that we're an outcrossing species, which is a fancy scientific way of saying that we're really susceptible to inbreeding. We need a lot of genetic diversity. And this is why if you look at a lot of so-called hunting gathering groups around the world, even though they live in small bands at a time, sometimes as few as 6 or 20 people, as high as 100 or more people, they're always on the move. And one of the things that we're just starting to understand about this in our Western anthropological framework is that people weren't constantly moving because resources were scarce. If anything, it was the opposite. Resources were everywhere. There was abundance everywhere. So why did people move? A lot of it had to do more so with social factors. People just, they had cousins over there in the other valley, and we'll camp for a while over here, and then we'll take our camp down and we'll move over there to be with them. And so a lot of indigenous people around the world practice what's known as exogamy, which basically means preferring to marry somebody who's outside your immediate kin or clan group. And again, that's just a way to keep our genetic integrity. And so trading pathways, while they may have originally been natural pathways and corridors for migrating animals like deer and elk and bison and such, and of course humans began to follow these animals, Um, Eventually they became trading pathways in their own right and kind of ended up in the human sphere. Of course, Europeans, after we came here, we turned a lot of these trading pathways into roads. And so often you can be driving down the road today and you're actually driving over the paved over remains of what was originally an indigenous trail system. But anyway, these trails were really the lifeblood of the people, because we can't live in small little groups in isolation. We always need to be interacting. And when we're interacting with these other groups, we're also trading seeds. We're trading germplasm of our favorite food and medicine plants. And it was through this process of translocating species from valley to valley at the hands of humans that we started to create the first domesticated species. Because basically, when you open up the genomes like that, you create a lot of physical variability, a lot of phenotypic diversity. Things look very different. This is why apples are so diverse, because they're hybridized and they've been brought along the Silk Road and all over Europe and Asia. And during that process of apples being moved around, they hybridized several different times with various crabapple species. And they created this much larger thing, which we know as the domesticated apple. But really what it is just this really complex hybrid. Human beings are actually, we're not very different from that. And that's partly why we have so much diversity. So, I'm trying to get at this, it's kind of beyond anti-racism. It's understanding that this scientific notion of purity, well, it's not a scientific notion, that's the whole point. This notion of purity is actually a religious ideal, which comes from Eurocentric ways of thinking. If you tune into nature, there's no such thing as purity. Everything is flux, everything is change. Species is all spectrum. Even the system of categorization, where we try to cordon off one species from another, doesn't really exist that concretely in nature. Everything's black and white. Evolution thrives on areas of gray. So I need to get more to the point here. So I showed these previous slides of the Mayan farming context versus the European farming context. How did we get there? How did they get there? Well, one of the ways was through cultural burning. This was a huge practice. I mean, it's deep in our human ancestry. It's partly what made us humans. It's what gave us smaller guts and larger brains, allowed us to cook food, allowed us to modify the landscape to a high degree, and basically be fruitful and multiply. And basically, it's what has enabled us to basically occupy almost all of the tropical and temperate regions of the globe. We're so adaptable because we can change, we can do ecological engineering to this high degree. And that is what has evolved into farming. So with fire management, cultural burning, you can reset, arrest, or turn back the clock of ecological succession. So it's incredibly useful. Often you get different kinds of species represented in different stages of succession. So if you can find a way to navigate through those stages of succession, i.e. with fire, you can navigate through what kinds of habitats you want to derive your abundant living from. Fire also does a lot of mineralization to the soil through the addition of ash and char. Suppresses weeds, enables seeds to germinate. So it's a great prequel to your gardening activities. This is why, like, the oldest form of farming that human beings have is what could be called fire stick farming. I mean, that's a term that's often applied to the Australian Aboriginal peoples, but it really refers to just this ancestral way of interacting with the landscape, where you've got a digging stick that's engaging in some tilling, you have some seeds that you're sowing, you have some fire that's taking back ecological succession a layer or two or three, and then you can, once the fire is swept through, you sow the seeds, through the action of the digging stick, digging roots and things, you're tilling the soil. And that is the bones of farming right there. But burning will also promote new shoots. through fire coppice, which later became coppice with steel tools and stone tools. But originally it began with observing how fire would burn a bush down to the ground or burn a tree down to the ground, and it would resprout. It's also a way to manage pests. You can manage insect diseases. A great example would be like the breaking the weevil cycle that it afflicts oaks and chestnuts and hickories. But you can also use the smoke from the fire to fumigate from fungal pathogens. Fire will also increase fruiting and masting. It'll increase flowering like 20%, and by extension, it'll increase, fruiting and masting of nut trees by like 20%. Coppicing was another important tool in how the landscape was managed. So the word Manhattan, there's been a lot of controversy over what that word actually means, but a linguist recently has pretty definitively demonstrated that Manhattan means where we go and cut hickory wood for bows, because on the south end of Long Island, in what's now New York City, there was a legendary grove of hickory trees, which included a lot of shellbark hickory, and it was well known to all the peoples of the Hudson Valley, and they would all travel there to coppice wood for bows, but to also gather nuts for eating, hickory nuts. Then there's also the Manatawny Creek that runs through the Ole Valley in Berks County, Pennsylvania. It means exactly the same thing, where we go to gather hickory wood for trees. And what grows all along the banks of that creek today? Shellbark hickory, as well as shagbark and bitternut, things like that. And this chinkapin oak, which is the sacred oak of the Ole Valley. But there's also bur oak and pawpaw, persimmon, honey locust, and all kinds of trees that tend to have unique associations with them that are associated also with native settlements, with native lifeways. And these trees form wonderful polycultures with each other, and all of them are amazing food trees. So native peoples were breeding. They were breeding tree crops. Might not have looked the way we do it with agronomy these days, where we're super focused on one trait or one narrow suite of traits that we want our trees to exhibit. Native peoples weren't really thinking that way, because first of all, they didn't practice monocultural agriculture the way we did. Like, diversity was always a strength. They didn't need everything to be uniform in shape and size and color and flavor. Their criteria was simple. It was, is this a good tree? Do we like the flavor? Is it fairly accessible? Like, can we crack into it, or is it just more trouble than it's worth? And so basically a good tree was anything that was accessible, anything that tasted good, anything that was productive. So unfavored tree would be whatever wasn't productive, whatever was just more trouble than it was worth, not very accessible, maybe really thick shells or something like that, or something that just tasted awful. So these trees would get culled for coppice, cut down for firewood, burned, hacked and burned away for garden space. And, that was the way breeding was done. You just remove the bad trees, promote the good trees. And a lot of trees were certainly intentionally planted, as we'll get into with the Milpa system. It's one of the things we notice about our tree crops. So this is from a native stand, and I use the word native as a double entendre, native as a native species, but also native because this was a place where native people interacted with this forest and managed it. It's a cultural landscape. So this is from a forest near Thanetsburg along the Conococheague Creek in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And all of these nuts were collected from basically within acres of each other. No more than a few miles of each other, but basically all in the same area. And you can see this tremendous amount of diversity in shape, and that diversity continues beyond skin deep. It's all the shell thicknesses are different. Some are very thin shelled, some are very thick shelled, and then there's all kinds of different flavors. taste like banana bread, some taste like maple pecan, some taste bland, some taste savory, and everywhere in between. What we're looking at is a landrace, just like with my example of the apple. This is, in my experience and opinion, this is the result of humans translocating this species from across valley in context. Robert Morris, one of the early founders of the NNGA, I couldn't find the exact quote, but I remember reading this in an early NNGA news magazine. He talks about how when he was a boy in the early, not the early 1800s, but in the 1800s, growing up in Louisiana, there were legendary black walnut trees with shells that were so thin that they could be cracked in your hands. And his lament was that nobody knew how to graft hickories or walnuts back then. So a lot of these trees didn't survive. They weren't, their genetics didn't get carried on. They either aged out and died, or they got cut down for firewood, or not firewood, but timber and whatnot. And nobody knew how to graft them at that. So that was the end of that. But this is a legacy of Native American breeding. So at the heart of all of this is the Mayan Milpa, which is particularly, this is the cultural assembly of Mesoamerica. If you come into Maine or Pennsylvania or Virginia or Kentucky or other places in North America, Native peoples probably wouldn't have called it the Milpa, but nevertheless, maize, beans, and squash was the centerfold of the system. And maize, beans, squash, the three sisters, this was imported all over. This was brought all over North America through the trading routes that I mentioned earlier. And so it's just like with our reductionist Western thinking, they didn't just bring those three plants with them. They brought a whole cultural package. They brought the Milpa system with them. So the first phase is slash and burn. You go into an area of forest, cut it down, let it dry for a season or two or three, and until it's ready to incinerate. And then it gets burned off. And now the ground is exposed. And so the Milpa gardener can come through and plant their seeds. Now, often they're planting 80 to 120 species at one time, and then everything starts to grow. But what you're doing is you're managing for succession. So what's the first thing that grows? The annual plants, your squashes, your maize, corn, your beans, your chili peppers, your amaranth, your goosefoots, your all the annual plants. And the perennials take a few more years to establish before they are flowering, fruiting, of harvestable size and things like that. So the reason why agriculture has focused so much on annual plants isn't so much that we found, it's not so much that we started to focus on things that didn't pay off nutritionally or ecologically. That didn't make a lot of ecological sense. Like, we didn't just simplify ecosystems for no reason. It was because originally agriculture was a cycle. It was shifting. We would go through all the phases of succession. And basically, over the years, we've forgotten the forest from trees. So it's a great example of myopic short-term thinking. So here's the Mayan garden, the Milpa garden, as it starts to grow up. You can see the corn, the beans, the squash, and other things. And then phase two, you get the Milpa garden. This is an established Milpa garden. You can see all the diversity. It's a polyculture, but it's also incredibly productive, incredibly abundant. And these gardens can be quite large. They can be several acres in size. And then phase three, it turns into mixed multicropped annuals alongside perennials starting to come online. So you can see the banana trees and whatnot. Phase four, it turns into an orchard garden. You get understory herbs and fruit and nut trees. Then it turns into a woodland, or like a park or something. And then phase six is the high forest, what we think of as virgin or pristine forest. Now they're now realizing that so much of what is thought of as virgin forest in places like the Amazon and Mesoamerica is actually anthropogenic, because the good food and medicine plants are overrepresented to such a degree that there's no way it happened without the interaction of human beings. Now they've done these studies in Brazil and the Amazon and Mesoamerica, but they haven't really done it in Eastern North America. But it's exactly the same thing here. It's the reason why oak hickory is such a dominant association. It's the reason why chestnut was so preponderant in certain areas. It's the reason why you can still find persimmon and pawpaw and plum around areas of native settlement. And here's the produce of the Milpa garden. A lot of diversity, a lot of nutrition, a lot of color. And there are cultural linguistic references to swiddening in North America, especially Eastern North America. For example, according to the Choctaw scholar, Reverend Alan Wright, he said that Alabama translated to the clears of thickets. Now, Alabama is the same word as Alabamaha or Altamaha, which, if you know the story of William Bartram and the Franklinia and how he was traveling on the Altamaha River in Georgia, it's the same word. So it means the clears of thickets. This was, I think it's a word that is common to the Muskogee Creek peoples. So you can imagine anywhere that this word was used, from Georgia to Alabama, people were clearing thickets, burning them off, planting Milpa-style gardens featuring the Three Sisters. But the downstream of these gardens is fruit and nut trees. Now, here where I am, on the lower Susquehanna River, there's a creek named the Pekowi, and that's named after the Pekowi clan group of the Shawnee. So this is the Wolf clan. They came from the Ohio River Valley region, presumably following the bison eastward. They ended up in settling in Lancaster, PA at one point after colonization was unfolding. But the name Pekowi or Pekowi means he is arising from the ashes. That's a reference to swiddening. That, everywhere they would go, they would, where they settled, they would do slash and burn. They would have a garden, and then it would turn into agroforestry. So, we can find old Shawnee gardens. I mean, even in Lancaster and York counties on the Susquehanna River, there's still a lot of hickory trees, a lot of persimmon, pawpaw, things like this, black walnut, chestnut. And then there's also the Sakiwaki, or what the French or the English speakers call the sock. And that means people coming forth from the opening, which you can also translate as clearing. People coming forth from the clearing, people of the yellow earth. It's a reference to swiddening. It's one of the most well-known references to Native American agroforestry comes from William Bartram, 1792. I'm running out of time here, so I'm not really going to read this, but the important thing to recognize here is that he's pointing out that the old Indian settlements were now deserted and overgrown with forests. Now, it wasn't that they were deserted, it was that they were left to regrow into forests. That's a crucial distinction in the understanding here. And he observed in ancient cultivated fields, all these amazing fruit and nut trees. And he also made some observations near Lake Cuskawila, which I think is in Georgia. And then in Maine, all the way up in Maine, you've got the Penobscot, and they've got the tail of the corn mother. And that's a story about swiddening. If you read the greater context here, this story is, first mother says, "Tomorrow at high noon you must do it. After you have killed me, let two of our sons take hold of my hair and drag my body over that empty patch of earth. Let them drag me back and forth over every part of the patch until all my flesh has been torn from my body. Afterwards, take my bones, gather them up, and bury them in the middle of this clearing, then leave that place." She smiled and said, "Wait 7 moons and then come back and you will find my flesh there, flesh given out of love, and it will nourish and strengthen you forever and ever." When you understand the swiddening process, that it begins with slash and burn, and then that slash is raked over the whole area so that it can evenly combust, and then it's incinerated, burned down to ashes, and then the seeds are sown back into the space, and then it regrows even more abundantly than it was before. It's been demonstrated that native peoples, through their shifting cultivation practices, actually increase biodiversity. They don't harm it. That's exactly what they're talking about here in this story. And so over hundreds of generations and thousands of years of such co-creation, you end up with cultural landscapes. There's a great example of, how beautiful these cultural landscapes were before colonization from this anonymous pioneer writer in Michigan, 1884. I really need to move quickly here, but here's the Parklands at Floyds Fork. This is outside of Louisville, Kentucky. And this is land that was historically occupied by the Shawnee people. And this is along a trail called the Wild Hyacinth Trail, which is named for this plant, the wild hyacinth, or Camassius psiloides. It's camas, which is a very important food to the peoples, especially the Pacific Northwest. But it was all over the Midwest, and it was even in the eastern United States, associated with Native American settlements. It was grown as a root food. So in this preserve, normally you don't just see this plant around anywhere, but it's here. It's very thick. It covers for miles and miles like a carpet. It's got edible roots. And when you cook them up, they're rich in inulin when they're raw, but you cook them up and the inulin converts to fructose and become very sweet, and the minerals and nutrition becomes very bioavailable. And what's the tree cover here above the camas? You've got American persimmon, you've got bur oak, you've got shellbark hickory, you've got honey locust. That's no accident. That's cultural landscape. Then you've got other plants too. You've got lilies, you've got Solomon seal, you've got harbinger of spring. Then another example, which I wrote about on my blog, nomadseed.com, is Owasco Flats. Owasco Flats. This is the bottom, the southern portion of Lake Owasco, that the outlet, I guess. And it's covered in shellbark hickories and bicolor oaks. The understory is groundnut, Apios americana, and also Anthocarpa bracteata, the so-called hog peanut or earth bean, which the Lakota call Makatoni cha. And then there's other cultural landscapes, like along the Conococheague, which means winding river with many bends. You find shellbark hickories in association with pawpaw, persimmon, groundnut, wapato, also known as Sagittaria, harbinger of spring, mulberry, chinkapin oak, bur oak, honey locust, and ramps. It's a food forest. You go along the Manatawny Creek, which is right next to Percy and Perkiomen, which means where we crack hickory nuts, and Manatawny means where we go to cut hickory wood for bows. And what do you find there? You find shellbark hickories, shagbark hickories, bitternut, pawpaw, calamus, wapato, black walnut, chinkapin oak, bur oak, honey locust, and ramps. The lower Susquehanna River, and like the Pekowi Creek that flows into her. Pekowi means he is arising from the ashes. What do you find there? You find shellbark hickories in association with old native settlements. Historically, shellbark hickory was in the River Hills area too. I think they've been mostly extirpated as far as I can tell, but there's pawpaw everywhere. There's American lotus, there's black walnut, there's butternut, mulberry, harbinger of spring, wild rice, groundnut, plum, chestnut, honey locust, persimmon. More food forest. And then you go to the Common de Gwinnett, a long way with many bends. You find shellbark hickories, pawpaw, persimmon, mulberry, chinkapin oak, bur oak, honey locust, black walnut, harbinger of spring. The Occoneechee Neck down in Jackson, North Carolina, which Occoneechee means descendants of the Oconee. And there you find more camas, it's disjunct there. It's one of only two populations in North Carolina, and the only population in eastern North Carolina, almost to the coastal plain. You've got a lot of pawpaw trees there, and a lot of oak trees, and some hickory and things like that. So in closing here, just encourage everyone to learn the history of whose land you're on. What is the deep indigenous history of your land? And you can find this out through books, some books. Unfortunately, there's not enough written about this kind of stuff, but you can also learn a lot just by listening deeply, because a lot of this stuff is still, the presence is still there in the land. And loving all is the most important practice. Practicing compassion, understanding, and all these things. It's through love that we start to learn how to put the pieces together and see the bigger reality. So that's my presentation. I think I went slightly over time here. It's been about a half hour, but that's pretty close to 25 minutes. So hopefully this is okay. And I'm happy to take any questions. Like I said, there's a lot more detail here that I wish I could have elaborated on. There was a study that came out, I guess last year or whatever, that basically concluded that native peoples in the Northeast didn't cut down or change the forest composition in any way, and that they didn't do widespread clearing for agriculture. And it's such an infuriating paper. And I remember talking about this with a lot of people because it's just so ignorant of the real history. And, it's also ignorant of the way that native people actually managed the forest, how they actually did agroforestry, how they actually did farming. And it basically takes all these Eurocentric assumptions about how farming was done, looks for the signs of that, doesn't find it, and then concludes that native people weren't doing farming or agroforestry. It's just, it's a bunch of nonsense. So, I hope that talks like this can kind of be an illumination for an inspiration. I share this information because I've found this through tons and tons of research and study and experiment, and it does not exist out there in books. You can't get this information anywhere else, and it really needs to be more widely known. Anyway, thank you, and be well.